The 16th of January 1943. It's a calm day at the Swan Island shipyard in Portland, Oregon. The brand new SS Schenectady lies peacefully at her moorings, having made it back safely from her sea trials, and she now awaits preparations for war service. But all of a sudden, a deafening crack rings out across the shipyard, echoing as far as a mile away. Out of nowhere, and for seemingly no apparent reason, the Schenectady's hull has cleaved almost completely in half. The incredible shipbuilding effort undertaken by the Allies in World War II saw the creation of thousands of vessels. T2 tankers, Victory, and especially Liberty ships have gone down in history for a number of reasons, namely their integral contribution to the Allied victory of World War II, the incredible story of their creation en masse, but, on a rather less positive note, their early tendency to split in two. As if afflicted by some kind of curse, the Schenectady was far from the only war industry ship to meet a catastrophic end. But what added still further to the growing worry surrounding these ships' failures was the mystery of why they were breaking in half at all. With multiple ships having split apart without a clear apparent cause, something was evidently going very wrong, and would go on to teach lessons in shipbuilding that are still in use to this day. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the story of the ships that broke in half. When the US joined the war, the Battle of the Atlantic had already been long raging, and the Allied forces were struggling to hold their own in what was effectively a war of tonnage. Merchant ships were being sunk by German U-boats at a staggering rate, persistently prowling the waters in search of their targets, and British shipyards simply couldn't build enough ships fast enough to replace those that were being lost. The situation was dire. In just a few months, from the beginning of March to the end of May 1941, 142 merchant ships were lost to U-boats. Without some kind of intervention, and fast, it looked like an Allied victory would inevitably slip out of reach. Cue the help of the United States. The pressing need for replacement ships set in motion the production of Liberty ships as part of the $350 million emergency shipbuilding program. Now, before this point, the established construction methods for ships like that were, frankly put, just way too slow to meet the incredible demands of wartime. Now, unlike the previous standard for riveted construction, the significant time pressures at play here required a more time-effective alternative: welding. The man behind this new approach to quick and efficient shipbuilding, the American industrialist Henry Kaiser, created the namesake Kaiser shipyards, which would go on to significantly outperform all other shipyards of the era in terms of sheer scale and speed of production. If you were to go and visit one of these shipyards on any given day during this time, you'd be met with a flurry of activity and noise. Workers in their overalls, helmets, and leather gloves, heaving their equipment with them as they dashed between workstations. It was something never seen before in shipbuilding history. A purpose-built assembly line, more like a car factory, run like clockwork and capable of churning out completed ships at unprecedented rates. But what's more, the switch from riveted construction to the use of welding, along with the urgent necessity of labour to help maintain production schedules, afforded an extensive workforce of comparatively unskilled workers the opportunity to add their own contribution to the war effort. Many of us are familiar with Rosie the Riveter, but the lesser-known Winnie or Wendy the Welder soon started appearing in various recruitment campaigns. Thousands joined the burgeoning workforce, even travelling from other parts of the US to do so, drawn by the promise of better wages, the learning of new skills, and the opportunity to do their bit. A significant number of the new welders on these shipyards were women or those from minority backgrounds. Never before had there been the same working opportunities available to so many. Unlike with riveting, which required more extensive training, welding was simpler and quicker to learn, with one new female welder quoted as saying it was just like sewing. Though it wasn't without its drawbacks. Working days were long, and the work itself was physically arduous and at times very dangerous. The War Shipping Administration was an agency set up to oversee the operations of civilian yards across the US, as well as coordinating with the British merchant bodies. They put into practice the construction of a suite of new ships, each designed to fill a crucial role in the war effort and be built quickly and cheaply. Victory ships were large cargo vessels that displaced around 15,000 tons. They could be up to 455 feet, 138.7 meters in length. Impressive vessels in and of themselves, but joining them on the stocks was a dazzling array of specialist tankers and vessels, chief among which were the T2 family of tankers, long, utilitarian ships designed to ferry petrol, diesel, and black crude oil across the Atlantic to power the ships, tanks, and trucks intended to land in France. But before the Victory ships, the real jewel in the crown of the emergency shipbuilding program were the Liberty ships. Incredibly, more than 2,700 Liberty ships were built across just 18 shipyards between 1941 and 1945. And by 1944, average construction times are said to have been around 42 days per ship, compared to a previous average production rate of around 245. In one remarkable instance, the Liberty ship SS Robert E. Peary was built in a record 5 days as part of a morale-boosting propaganda effort. Now, these ships and the people creating them were making the impossible possible. Capable of carrying over 10,000 tons of cargo and over 441 feet long, the Liberty ship was adapted from existing British plans and appealed in its relative cost-effectiveness and fast construction potential. They were originally designated EC2SC1, that is, emergency cargo between 400 to 450 feet, where S referred to their 2,500 horsepower triple expansion steam engine, and C1 their specific design. These utilitarian ships were, on the whole, a little outdated. They were slow, and according to many, they weren't much to look at, even earning the nickname Ugly Ducklings. But despite this, they'd play a crucial part in delivering weapons and supplies to Allied troops, providing a key lifeline that finally offered a way to counter the devastating effects of the U-boats. President Franklin D. Roosevelt stated that these ships would bring liberty to Europe, effectively coining the name that they would come to be referred to forever. They'd become a symbol of hope, strength, and resilience. But not all was well. Liberties had been designed for mass production. Now, it might seem immediately apparent that anything that's set up to be manufactured quickly, cheaply, and with the use of relatively unskilled workers should immediately raise a question of quality and durability, but so far at least everything seemed to have been going according to plan. But this was about to change. The first truly significant blow to this new surge in shipbuilding came in the form of the SS Schenectady, and she would certainly not be the last. While fractures of varying extents had previously been reported in a number of different ships, nothing as bad as this had ever happened before. The Schenectady was actually a T2 SE A1, or a T2 tanker, effectively the tanker counterpart to Liberty ships. She was built by the Kaiser Shipbuilding Company, and the Schenectady was the first to be constructed at the new Swan Island shipyard. At around 523 feet long, though almost comically small in comparison to modern equivalents, these 6,000 horsepower tankers were both bigger and faster than the Liberties, capable of speeds around 15 knots, compared to the more sluggish 11 knots of the Liberty ship. Now, originally, these were intended to use steam turbines, but a shortage of the available machine tools necessary to make the gears meant that they would instead turn to turbo-electric propulsion. As with the Liberties, the workhorse T2 fuel tankers were a crucial asset to the war effort, delivering crude oil, petrol, and diesel to those fleets already out at sea, fuel that they were completely dependent on. As such, the Axis knew to target them. That meant that, just like the Liberty ships, speed was the name of the game when it came to the construction of these vessels, and production time for the T2 tankers was rapid, with 533 of them being built by the US from 1940 to 1945, courtesy of the United States Maritime Commission. The SS Schenectady's construction was completed ahead of schedule in December 1942, but then, not even 1 month later, without warning, she fractured almost completely in two while sitting still, moored at her fitting wharf. The water was calm, the weather was mild, there was no discernible reason why this had happened, and yet the sight of the vessel jackknifed where she stood in the fitting out berth, along with the immense noise that accompanied the split, was undeniable. Now, this was unfortunately just the start of the problem. Later that year, a Liberty ship would befall a similar dramatic fate. The 422-foot, 7,176-ton SS John P. Gaines, named for the Army officer and politician John Pollard Gaines, had been built by the Oregon Shipbuilding Company and launched on 11th July 1943. On the night of November 24, 1943, around 100 miles off the Alaskan coast, she was busy undergoing her second voyage, setting out from Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands, headed for Seattle. The North Atlantic was facing an increasingly rough winter, with plummeting temperatures, powerful swells, and winds up to 100 knots. It was in just such a storm that the SS John P. Gaines would meet her fate. At around 10 p.m. ship's time, the crew of the vessel reported hearing sudden, loud, cracking noises, loud enough to register even over the roar of the ongoing storm. Knowing it would be impossible to identify the source of the noise in the crushing darkness, they continued on, but then, at 2:41 a.m., when all but the watchmen were asleep, disaster struck. The waves, which had already been wreaking havoc on the ship, had only intensified as the night wore on. A surge struck the vessel, then another, causing her to bend dramatically, and then, with a terrible metallic grinding, the ship's hull was torn in two, the bow drifting away and sinking below the inky water. As it turned out, the initial noises heard aboard the ship had been the beginnings of a port side fracture from the number 3 cargo hatch. The repeated forces of the waves caused the break to propagate out towards the deck and ultimately tore it apart. Luckily, due to the effective warning bell that the early noise had signalled, those on board had already moved to the relative safety of the stern. As they awaited rescue, they had to pray that what remained of the John P. Gaines wouldn't capsize. The ship's 4 lifeboats were launched, stationed nearby the stern in case it too should founder, and the crew struggled to make sure that her exposed bulkhead was turned to be protected from the relentless wind and waves. Volunteers threw together makeshift life rafts from strung together oil drums and hastily cut wood. Incredibly, the watertight bulkhead held, managing to keep them afloat until help arrived 33 hours later. Survivors were loaded into the lifeboats, cold, wet, and tired, only lightly clothed in the icy conditions thanks to how quickly they'd had to jump from their bunks during the night. The rescue efforts went on through the small hours. Grappling with the darkness and roiling waters, they attempted to set lines between the rescue ships and the wreck, but tragically, one lifeboat carrying 10 men was swept away after the heaving line broke, and it was never seen again. The 4th and final lifeboat was picked up the next morning, and the 70 total survivors of the John P. Gaines were delivered safely to Seattle, their ordeal finally over. Something was clearly up with these emergency wartime ships. In the end, some 1,500 examples of what were deemed significant fractures, that is, cracks in the steel, were discovered in the shell plating of their hulls, and 12 emergency wartime ships had broken apart without warning before the war was over. Hundreds and hundreds had been built, and they'd served well without being lost to structural failure, but enough had been lost that alarm bells were starting to ring, and then, 7 years after the war had finished, it happened again. It was the same nor'easter that had sunk John P. Gaines that took down 2 more World War II-era T2 tankers in February 1952. Built by the Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company and launched towards the end of 1945, the 10,000-ton SS Fort Mercer never actually saw service. Though the war was now over, many wartime T2 tankers were actually still in use. Some were being sold off and turned even into passenger ships, some were allocated and redistributed to US owners, and others were acquired by the US Navy. In the 1950s, both the SS Pendleton and the SS Fort Mercer were being used for fuel transport. Another product of the Kaiser shipyards, the Pendleton, like the Schenectady, had her start at Portland's Swan Island Yard. It was Tuesday, 12th of February 1952, that she set off from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, bound for Boston, carrying 122,000 barrels of kerosene and oil. That same morning, the SS Fort Mercer departed Norco, Louisiana, with full cargo and a crew of 44 headed for Maine. The first few days at sea were without incident, but by that weekend, as both ships neared Long Island, the wind started to pick up and the waves got choppier. A storm had begun to set in, one that would become one of the worst seen by the area in living memory. The crew of both vessels were now facing a perilous battle with the elements. Sea heights reportedly reached as much as 60 feet. Visibility was minimal with the snow driving on, and 70-mile-per-hour winds were so strong you had to lean into them just to keep your feet. The gale was only worsening as the hours passed, and then, a little before 6 a.m., Monday, the 18th of February, as the Pendleton continued to be buffeted by the waves off the coast of Cape Cod, an explosive-sounding cracking was heard. More quickly than anyone could possibly have the time to comprehend what was happening, the SS Pendleton ruptured in half between the number 7 and 8 cargo holds. There had been no warning signs. The bow section was rapidly carried away by the storm, along with the Pendleton's captain, John J. Fitzgerald, 7 other crew members, and the ship's radio room, leaving the remaining 33 crew members on the stern section with no way to send a distress call. They were completely alone. They acted with remarkable courage, keeping calm, and they worked quickly, shutting the watertight doors, and in doing so, enabling the stern section to actually just stay afloat. In lieu of a radio SOS, they managed to blow the ship's steam whistle by rigging it to a line and heaving on it. Now all they could do was wait for help. That is, if anyone would come at all. The Coast Guard was, however, already preoccupied. Around the same time as the Pendleton was grappling to stay afloat, the Fort Mercer was to become yet another T2 tanker to break in half. But in her case, though, the men were at least given a little more time to prepare. The first sign of what was to come arrived at 8:10, when all too familiar by now, a whip-like crack was heard and the ship's load of oil started to spill into the surrounding ocean on the starboard side. Now, knowing full well the reputation and history of the earlier T2 tankers, Captain Frederick Paetzel turned the weakened vessel away from the waves in an effort to keep the fracture from propagating further, and then he radioed for help. At 10:30, the sound of ripping metal rang out again, and the tear near the number 5 cargo hold worsened, with still more fuel being lost to the waves. Another frantic SOS was sent out by noon. As the heavy seas continued to wreak havoc on the tanker, one last terrible cracking signaled what everyone aboard had been fearing those last few hours. The Fort Mercer's hull had been torn apart. The stern section, along with 34 of her crew, was drifting further and further away from the bow. Captain Paetzel and 8 of his men were precariously trapped in the bridge, not daring to move as the seas tossed the bow violently, and unable to do anything but watch as part of the deck was dragged below the murky waters, taking the ship's lifeboats with it. As if there wasn't already enough to concern themselves with, buffeted by the unrelenting winds, the bow, rendered completely at the mercy of the waves without any engine power, was now hurtling back towards the stern section, coming perilously close to colliding. Thankfully, the stern still had its engine, and the quick-thinking efforts of the engineers served to actually maneuver the stern out of the way of a potential collision course. 4 Coast Guard vessels, the Eastwind, the Unimac, the Yakutat, and the McCulloch, had all been diverted to the Mercer's aid. At the Chatham Coast Guard station, 2 objects had been identified by radar operators, what they supposed at first were the 2 sections of the bisected SS Fort Mercer, but a Coast Guard PBY Catalina was sent to investigate and spotted that what they'd actually identified was the SS Pendleton, and it was suddenly apparent they were dealing with not 1, but 2 ships that were split in half and in need of help, and fast. The ensuing rescue has since been immortalised in literature and film, going down in history as one of the Coast Guard's most daring rescue attempts ever to take place. It was one little motor lifeboat, the CG 36500, that managed to heed the call. At just 36 feet long, the 90 horsepower TRS model lifeboat was massively dwarfed by the Pendleton's 504-foot long hull, and surely should be no match for waves as high as 6-story buildings. The crew of 4 was led by coxswain Bernard C. Webber. To say that the CG 36500's journey to reach the Pendleton's stern was treacherous would be an understatement. Immensely powerful waves were throwing the small boat around like a cat playing with its prey, at one point causing the lifeboat to fall onto her side and both the compass and the windshield to be shattered. In the words of Bernard Webber, the other men were knocked to the deck time after time. I thought several times I'd lost my whole crew. They looked like goners, but they managed to hold on. The stranded crew of the Pendleton had been waiting all day for rescue, unsure if anyone was even aware of their predicament at all. Fireman Frank Fateau would later state that the glorious sight of the bobbing light of the approaching lifeboat left them spellbound. Upon finally reaching the tanker's towering stern section, a process which itself had taken hours, the Coast Guard's troubles were far from over. All 8 crew who'd been stranded on the Pendleton's bow were lost. There was now a desperate rush to evacuate the remaining survivors from the stern, while trying to prevent the lifeboat itself from being smashed into the Pendleton by the immense rolling waves. A light rope Jacob's ladder was lowered, and one by one the men began to make the hazardous climb down to rescue. Though the CG 36500 was only intended to carry a maximum of 12 passengers, due to the great bravery and determination of those involved, all but one of the 33 men was successfully piled into the tiny boat and brought to safety. The ship's cook, George "Tiny" Myers, who'd valiantly helped his fellow crewmen during the rescue, had been tragically lost to the sea. Meanwhile, back aboard the fractured remains of the Mercer, the 9 crewmen, including the ship's captain, had been crowded in the chart room without heat or light for hours now, and as midnight approached, the already listing bow had begun sinking lower into the sea. The men would have to move. Utilizing an improvised rope comprised of signal flags, they managed to successfully reach the forecastle ahead of them. Poor visibility and gale force conditions made their first attempts at rescue tragically unsuccessful, with 5 crewmen being lost in the process. The Coast Guard had no choice but to wait till dawn. As soon as there was enough daylight, the US CGC cutter Yakutat launched a monomoy surf boat to pick up the remaining survivors, including Captain Paetzel from the bow. Not without considerable difficulty though, using a combination of surf boats, shot lines, and a rubber life raft, all 4 men were eventually retrieved. Just 21 minutes after the last survivor had left the bow section, at around 10:51 AM on February 19th, it capsized completely. There was no loss of life from the Fort Mercer's stern section. In fact, 13 of the 34 men there opted not to be rescued straight away, choosing instead to stay on in the hope that they'd be able to possibly salvage the hulk. The stern was actually successfully towed a few days later, and eventually refitted with a new bow to become the SS San Jacinto. But the curse of the T2 tanker had not fully lifted. Thanks to an explosion in her cargo tanks, the San Jacinto would actually split in half again in 1964. So what had gone wrong? How was it that these innovative new shipbuilding techniques could result in vessels that would seem to do just fine on the water one day and then the next could suddenly break apart, even in seemingly benign conditions? The common denominator seemed to have been the new, prefabricated, all-welded ship designs. Similarities between these failures were starting to be recognised, kind of like patterns. Where significant structural ruptures had occurred, they tended to begin amidships, often when they'd been exposed to cold water temperatures, and the fractures would typically propagate out from a common origin, the square corners of the hatches. The sharp angles here created a stress concentration in the steel, exacerbated further by the frequent overloading during wartime conditions. But unlike when hull construction consisted of separate steel plates being riveted together, where each join could act as a crack arrestor, essentially preventing any fractures from spreading too far, the all-welded ships provided a continuous steel surface across which cracks could spread unimpeded. But early investigations were quick to place the blame on the inexperienced welders behind the construction of the Liberty ships and the T2 tankers. It was floated that poor quality welding had led to repeated incidents of ships breaking in two, and after all, it seemed the most obvious explanation. These weren't isolated incidents, and the evidence at the time did seem to point towards defective welding. The American Bureau of Shipping's investigations into the Schenectady's breaking up, for example, concluded that it must have been the result of locked-in stresses attributed to the apparently faulty welding. Therefore, if quality control of welding were to be improved, no further disasters should be seen. But as we know, after the Second World War, more problems did occur. Now later, as investigations reopened, it was supposed that notches in the steel rendered these tankers unable to withstand the bending of normal wave action without creating fractures. So it was proposed that the fitting of riveted steel straps across the hull could help remedy the problem. But both the Pendleton and the Fort Mercer had both been fitted with the mandated crack arrestors, so clearly significant structural failure was still going on. It wasn't until years after that those first ship's fractures had been spotted that research revealed the mystery of why these ships were splitting was far more complicated than first realized. Regardless of the quality of the welding work, these early ships could be more or less destined to fail for a much broader reason. This was in fact more of a question of metallurgy. Sure, a faulty weld certainly wouldn't help, but it was actually the chemistry of the steel used in the skeleton of the ship itself that was sealing their fates. The steel used in the construction of these ships did comply with the established specifications for standards at the time, but testing of steel like this was only required to be performed at room temperature, and only with a very small specimen size. The war industries were pushing production to a scale and speeds never before seen, but this was still relatively early in the days of understanding the molecular structure of metal. Established testing methods were not yet capable of reflecting the extremes of operation. Because of this, early war mass-produced ships were effectively only being tested once they were already in use, which was of course far too late. They'd come to find that the ability to predict the performance of large steel structures would be vitally important, not just to help prevent further losses, but to help inform designers of ships into the future. Now, no testing variation was observed in riveted versus welded structures either, meaning that these tests weren't sufficient to flag the issues that would arise due to varied temperatures. But as it turned out, temperature played a huge part. Though it wasn't understood at the time, the suddenness of the SS Schenectady's breaking apart, though shocking, is a characteristic of what is called brittle failure. It was a woman named Constance Tipper of Cambridge University who first proposed the idea that it could be the properties of the ship's steel itself, not the welding work, that was causing Liberty ships and T2 tankers to become brittle. She linked the cold temperatures that the ships were being exposed to during service with a transition in steel behaviour from ductile, that is relatively soft and malleable, to brittle, that is likely to shatter like glass. With variations in the steel composition and the microstructure making fracture more likely in many incidences than in others, in the case of the SS Schenectady, it was found that despite the appearance of calm weather conditions at the time her hull broke, it was more so the cold temperatures of the North Atlantic that were the problem. Because of this, she developed a way of measuring brittleness using the so-called tipper test, which is a method that's still used to this day. Now, using the tipper test, it's possible to predict how different samples of steel would behave at different temperatures. It was indicated that when the steel contained too high a percentage of sulfur or phosphorus, it was much more likely to become brittle and prone to breakage. These kinds of impurities in steel could result from the hastened construction process, and of course, during the war, when materials were simultaneously in high demand and short supply, it was difficult to be picky. People have often wondered why Titanic, for example, broke apart when she sank, when other liners like Britannic and Lusitania were exposed to similar stresses on their hulls during sinkings without issue. But Titanic sank in water that was freezing, and her steel contained high concentrations of sulfur and phosphorus, thanks to the relatively primitive method of casting in acid-lined open hearth furnaces back then. Titanic wasn't badly built or designed. You couldn't blame her riveters for the breakup, but she was a product of her time, and the full microscopic characteristics of metal were not yet fully understood. As far as the Liberty and the T2 ships were concerned, the proposed solution of adding riveted crack arresters was very much like putting a band-aid on an open wound. Like with updated ship designs using rounded hatch corners wherever possible to reduce stress concentrations, these measures could, and did, help prevent fractures from escalating into total structural failure. But they didn't address the actual underlying problem, in that it was the metal itself that was failing. As a result of the research into these ships that split in half, it was now clearly apparent that using inferior grade steel was not an option, something that may have gone unnoticed if not for the phenomenon of the Liberty ship's rapid construction. In spite of their clearly less than ideal start, the truth was that Liberty ships and T2 tankers and the Victory ships were all instrumental to the war effort. Simply put, the war would likely not have been won that quickly without their contribution. Although the hasty construction times had their drawbacks in terms of structural integrity, the record-breaking construction was undoubtedly a significant achievement, and still to this day, being the most ships ever produced using a single design. It's unlikely that these construction times will ever be equaled again, nor hopefully will there ever be another need for such urgency that would require so many to be built so quickly. But probably most importantly, the learnings from these early failures of those vessels helped provide the very foundations of our understanding of modern fracture mechanics, informing and shaping future shipbuilding principles and safety guidelines, learnings that were applicable to other feats of engineering too, like bridges and aircraft. In spite of all their hardships, these ships ultimately provided a win, not just for the war effort, but for the advancement of scientific research, even decades later, to this day. On the topic of judging past construction techniques from the modern day, a conclusion found by a metallurgical study on steel samples taken from Titanic's wreck summed it up very well. The steel, they said, used in constructing the RMS Titanic was probably the best plain carbon ship plate available in the period of 1909 to 1911, but it would not be acceptable at the present time for any construction purposes, and particularly not for ship construction. If the Titanic had not collided with the iceberg, it could have had a career of more than 20 years, as the Olympic had. It was built of similar steel in the same shipyard and from the same design. The only difference was a big iceberg. The same is absolutely true of the emergency wartime ships. They were a crucial asset and a product of their time, and as our understanding of science and physics has improved, so too have our own standards. Part of our great understanding today has got to be attributed to the lessons learned from the ships that broke in half. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.